On the 16th of September, 1921, 5 figures step onto a frozen shore at the edge of the known world. This is Wrangel Island, a pale sliver of tundra resting between the Chukchi and East Siberian seas, closer to Siberia than to any place they might call home. The supply ship that brought them here will not return for 11 months. Their provisions are calculated for 6, and the man who organized this expedition, the famous explorer Vilhjalmur Stefansson, remains behind in civilization, confident his young team can claim this island for the British Empire. In the next few minutes, we will trace their journey together. By minute 2, you will see the small tent where 4 young men and 1 Inuk woman first make their camp. By minute 4, you will understand why the ice refused to let rescue ships pass. And by minute 6, you will meet Ada Blackjack, the seamstress from Nome who would become the sole survivor of this quiet, forgotten tragedy. Tonight we rest beside their story. The wind is steady, the hour is late, and Wrangel Island waits beneath the polar stars, patient and still. We travel far. We journey to a place most maps forget, a small island resting in the Arctic Ocean, where the Chukchi Sea meets the East Siberian Sea. The year is 1921, and 5 souls step onto frozen ground, believing they will stay for just 1 year. They do not know what awaits them. They cannot see the long winter ahead. Before we begin, let us pause for a small moment of acknowledgement. This is a story of hardship. It is a story of hunger, of cold, of isolation. We will speak of these things gently, with care, because they deserve to be told with dignity. There will be no alarming sounds, no sudden shifts in tone. We move slowly here as the Arctic itself moves, steadily, quietly, with patience. If you are listening as you drift towards sleep, you are welcome. If you are listening during a long drive or while your hands are busy with quiet work, you are welcome too. This story will wait for you. It will not rush. We will learn about the men and the woman who came to this island. We will sit with them in their tent as the lantern flickers against canvas walls. We will watch the sun set and not rise again for many weeks, and we will stay with them softly until the end. So let your breathing slow. Let the day's noise fade behind you. The wind is gentle now. Let your shoulders settle. We begin this story together, softly from the beginning. On a map of the northern world, if you let your eyes drift past the familiar coastlines of Canada and Alaska, past the Bering Strait where 2 continents nearly touch, you will find a speck of land floating in the gray expanse between Russia and the Arctic ice cap. This is Wrangel Island. It sits at approximately 71 degrees north latitude, 177 degrees west longitude, a forgotten sliver of tundra, 100 miles long and perhaps 50 miles wide, surrounded by some of the most unforgiving ice on Earth. In the summer of 1921, this island existed in a kind of political limbo. Russia had claimed it decades before, but the Soviet government, still young and distracted by revolution, had not visited the island in years. To certain ambitious minds in the Western world, this seemed like an opportunity, a chance to plant a flag on unclaimed Arctic territory and add another piece of the map to the British Empire. One such mind belonged to Vilhjalmur Stefansson. Stefansson was, by 1921, one of the most famous explorers in the world. Born in Canada to Icelandic parents, he had spent years traveling the Arctic, living among indigenous communities and developing theories about polar survival that challenged conventional wisdom. His most celebrated idea was what he called the friendly Arctic, the notion that the far north was not a frozen wasteland of death, but a livable environment where a resourceful person could thrive. He had written books about this theory. He had given lectures in grand halls across North America and Europe. Audiences listened, captivated, as he described hunting caribou on the sea ice, living for months on meat and fat alone, traveling vast distances with minimal supplies. Stefansson spoke with the confidence of a man who had done these things himself, and in fairness, he had. He was not entirely wrong about the Arctic's possibilities. But he was, perhaps, too optimistic about what untrained men could accomplish in one of the Earth's most demanding environments. In his office, a warm room lined with books and maps where a lamp burned steadily on his desk, Stefansson began to plan a new venture. He would send a small party to Wrangel Island. They would spend 1 year there, living off the land, claiming the territory for Britain. A supply ship would visit them the following summer. It would be, he believed, a simple and glorious undertaking. Stefansson himself would not go. He was past 50 now, and his days of sleeping on ice were behind him. But he would organize the expedition from afar, recruit the members, arrange the financing, and wait for news of their success. The financing proved difficult. The Canadian government, which Stefansson first approached, declined to support the venture. They saw little value in a frozen island so far from their shores, and they sensed the diplomatic complications that might arise from antagonizing Russia. Britain's colonial office expressed polite interest but offered no funds. In the end, Stefansson scraped together private backing, enough to charter a small ship and purchase supplies for what he estimated would be a comfortable year. He began seeking volunteers. The men who would answer his call were not seasoned Arctic veterans. Stefansson's fame had attracted young admirers, men who had read his books and dreamed of polar adventure. They were enthusiastic, healthy, and brave, but they were also, for the most part, inexperienced. They had not spent winters on the sea ice. They did not know how quickly the Arctic could turn hostile. We will meet them soon, these 5 who volunteered. For now, let us remain in Stefansson's office a moment longer, watching the lamp light flicker across his papers as he writes letters, drafts plans, and imagines the flag rising over Wrangel Island. Outside the window, the city hums with summer traffic. The Arctic seems very far away, a place of clean white silence, waiting patiently for those who would come. Stefansson believed in his vision. He believed that the friendly Arctic would provide for his team, that the hunting would be good, that the ice would behave, and that 1 year would pass without incident. He had faith in the land and in the resilience of determined men. But faith, as the coming months would show, is not the same as preparation. And optimism, however sincere, cannot melt the ice or bring ships through when the sea refuses to open. For now the papers rustle on his desk. The summer light slants through the window, and somewhere to the north, beyond all the maps on his wall, Wrangel Island waits in silence. Here, let us pause. Let your breath settle. The story has begun, and we will carry it forward gently, step by step. There is no hurry in the Arctic. Reset the papers rustle on his desk. Outside, the city hums with summer. The Arctic waits, quiet and far away. Let us now turn our attention to the 5 people who would make this journey. We will learn their names, their faces, the places they came from. We will try to understand what led each of them to sign on for a year in one of the loneliest places on Earth. The first and the leader of the expedition was Allan Crawford. Crawford was just 22 years old in 1921, a recent graduate of the University of Toronto. He was the son of a professor, raised in an academic household where books and ideas were valued above adventure. Yet something in Stefansson's lectures had stirred him. Crawford was athletic, earnest, and ambitious. He wanted to make a name for himself, to do something extraordinary before settling into ordinary life. When Stefansson offered him command of the Wrangel Island party, Crawford accepted without hesitation. He was young for such responsibility. He had never led men in the field. He had never spent a winter in the Arctic. But he was eager, and Stefansson, who preferred enthusiasm to experience, found him suitable. The second member was Lorne Knight. Knight was older than Crawford, 28, and had some relevant experience. He had worked as a member of Stefansson's earlier Canadian Arctic expedition, spending time in the north and learning the rhythms of polar survival. He knew how to hunt seal and polar bear. He understood the dangers of thin ice and sudden storms. Of all the men in the party, Knight was the most qualified. Yet Knight also carried a vulnerability. His health was not as robust as it appeared. He had suffered illness before, and though he seemed fit when he volunteered, his body would prove less resilient than his spirit when the long winter tested him. The third was Fred Maurer. Maurer, like Knight, was 28. He came from Ohio, a state far from any ice, but he had traveled north before. He was steady, practical, and hard-working, a man more comfortable with action than with words. He joined the expedition because he believed in the adventure and trusted Stefansson's judgment. He did not ask too many questions. The fourth was Milton Galle. Galle was the youngest of the men, just 19 years old. He was a Texan, raised in a warm climate, unaccustomed to cold. He was training to become a scientist and saw the expedition as an opportunity to gather data, to study the Arctic environment, and to contribute something meaningful before returning to his studies. His youth gave him energy and optimism. It also meant he had less experience with hardship than even his companions. And finally, there was Ada Blackjack. Ada was different from the others in nearly every way. She was 23 years old, an Inupiat woman from Nome, Alaska. She was not a scientist or an adventurer. She was a seamstress, a mother who had joined the expedition because she needed work. Her young son, Bennett, was ill and required medical care that Ada could not afford on her meager wages in Nome. When she heard that the expedition needed someone to sew and mend clothing, to repair the furs and canvas that would keep the party warm, she volunteered. Ada did not want to go to Wrangel Island. She was quiet, shy, and unfamiliar with the men she would be traveling with. She was afraid of polar bears. She had never fired a rifle, but she needed the money, and she trusted that the expedition would last only a year. She would work hard, earn her pay, and return to her son. She could not know, when she boarded the ship in Nome, that she would be the only one to come back. Let us hold these 5 names gently now: Crawford, Knight, Maurer, Galle, and Ada. They were not heroes when they departed. They were ordinary people, young, hopeful, and perhaps a little naive. They trusted Stefansson's planning. They believed the Arctic would be manageable. They imagined themselves returning with stories of adventure, their photographs in newspapers, their futures bright. We know now what they did not know then, but we will not rush toward that knowledge. We will stay with them as they were, full of hope, full of life, standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. And perhaps, as we learn their stories, we may ask ourselves a question. What drives a person to leave everything familiar behind, to travel into emptiness for the sake of a dream that may never come true? Is it courage, or is it something else, something we cannot quite name? This is not a question with an easy answer. Perhaps you have your own thoughts. Perhaps, as you rest tonight, you will turn this over in your mind. There is no need to decide. The question itself is enough. For now, we leave the 5 on the threshold of their journey. The ship is being loaded in Nome. The summer is fading, and far to the north, Wrangel Island waits, indifferent and cold. 5 names, 5 lives. Each one hopping the ice will be kind. We will learn them slowly, one by one. The ship that would carry them north was called the Silver Wave. It was not a large vessel, a modest wooden craft built for coastal waters rather than heavy ice. But in September 1921, it was the ship available, and so it would have to do. The expedition's budget had been stretched thin. There was no money for a proper icebreaker, no funds for a backup vessel. The Silver Wave would make one trip to Wrangel Island, deposit its passengers and their supplies, and return before the ice closed in. On a gray morning in Nome, Alaska, the 5 members of the expedition gathered on the dock. The air was already cold, carrying the first hints of the winter to come. Seabirds called overhead. The water of the harbor was dark and calm. Crawford stood at the rail as the crates were loaded aboard, boxes of hardtack and pemmican, sacks of flour, tins of tea, ammunition for the rifles, tools, canvas, rope. The supplies seemed substantial as they were carried up the gangway, but in truth, they were calculated for 6 months, perhaps a little more. Stefansson had assured them that hunting would supplement their stores. The Arctic was friendly after all. Ada stood apart from the men, watching quietly. She wore her warmest coat, her hands folded in front of her. She had said goodbye to her son Bennett that morning, holding him close in the dim light of their small room. She had promised to return. She had promised to bring money for his care. Now, as the ship prepared to depart, she whispered a prayer and tried not to look back at the shore. The Silver Wave left Nome on September 9, 1921. The crossing of the Chukchi Sea took just over a week. The weather was cooperative, gray skies, steady winds, moderate swells. The ship pushed northward, past the tip of Alaska, past the imaginary line where charts grew vague and few ships ventured. The water grew colder. Ice began to appear, scattered floes at first, then larger sheets that required careful navigation. On September 15, the lookout sighted land. Wrangel Island rose from the sea like a low, gray shadow. There were no trees, not a single one. The coast was a ragged line of gravel beaches and rocky cliffs, backed by rolling tundra that climbed toward distant hills. Snow already dusted the higher elevations. The sky above was pale and heavy. The ship anchored offshore the following morning, September 16. There was no harbor, no dock, only the open beach. The crew lowered small boats and the unloading began. It took several trips to ferry all the supplies to shore. The men worked steadily, carrying crates across the wet gravel, stacking them above the high tide line. Ada helped where she could, her slight frame dwarfed by the boxes she lifted. The wind was sharp, cutting through their clothing, reminding them that summer was already over in this place. By afternoon, the supplies were ashore. Crawford gathered the party together and they performed a brief ceremony, the raising of the Union Jack. The flag snapped in the wind, a small splash of color against the gray landscape. They were claiming this island for Britain, or so they believed. In truth, the claim would never be recognized by any government, but in that moment, standing on the cold tundra, they felt the weight of history. The captain of the Silver Wave did not linger. He was anxious about the ice, which was already thickening in the channels to the south. Within hours of the unloading, the ship weighed anchor and turned toward home. The five stood on the beach and watched it go. The Silver Wave grew smaller against the gray horizon, its dark hull shrinking, its engine sound fading into the wind. And then it was gone, vanished beyond the curve of the sea, leaving nothing but the endless ice and sky. They were alone now. The silence that followed was enormous. It was not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a world without human presence. A silence that seemed to press against the ears, to fill the chest, to make the heart beat louder in its absence. The wind hummed across the tundra. Somewhere, a bird called and received no answer. Crawford turned to his companions. There was work to do. They needed to establish camp, to organize their supplies, to prepare for the winter ahead. The ship would return in 1 year, next September when the ice broke again. Until then, they had only themselves and what they had brought. Ada looked once more at the empty horizon, where the ship had disappeared. Then she turned and followed the others inland. The ship grows small against the gray. The engine sound fades, and then there is only the wind. The first task was shelter. Stefansson had provided the expedition with a large canvas tent, a sturdy structure, perhaps 12 feet across, supported by wooden poles and secured with ropes and stakes. It was the kind of tent used by Arctic travelers for generations, designed to withstand heavy winds and to retain the heat of a small stove. In theory, it was adequate. In practice, it would prove both their refuge and their prison for the long months ahead. The men worked together to erect it, driving stakes into the frozen ground with mallets, stretching the canvas taut, lashing the poles in place. Ada watched and learned, helping where she could, holding ropes steady as the others tied them off. The wind tugged at the canvas, snapping it like a sail, but eventually the tent took shape, a pale cone against the gray landscape, fragile and defiant. Inside, they arranged their belongings. Sleeping bags were rolled out along the perimeter. Crates of food were stacked in one corner. A small stove was set up near the center, its pipe extending through a reinforced hole in the roof. When they lit the stove for the first time, a circle of warmth spread through the tent, pushing back the cold that seeped through the canvas walls. And then there was the lantern. It was a simple kerosene lamp, the kind found in any general store. But in this place, at the edge of the world, it became something more. When the first evening fell and the gray light outside faded to black, Crawford lit the lantern and set it on a crate near the entrance. The flame caught, steadied, and began to glow, a small circle of gold in the gathering dark. The lantern light would become their constant companion. In the weeks and months ahead, when the sun disappeared entirely and the polar night swallowed the island, that lantern would burn through the darkness. Its gentle flicker would illuminate their faces as they ate, as they talked, as they read and wrote and waited. It would be the last thing they saw before sleep and the first thing they saw when they woke. It was warmth made visible, hope made tangible. For now, on their first evening, they gathered around it and ate a simple meal, pemmican and hardtack, washed down with tea brewed on the stove. The tent canvas rippled in the wind. Outside, the tundra stretched away into shadow. They did not speak much. They were tired from the work of the day, and the strangeness of their situation was still settling over them. In the days that followed, they began to explore their surroundings. The camp was located near the northwestern coast of the island, on a stretch of gravel beach backed by low, rolling hills. The tundra was a patchwork of brown and gray mosses, lichens, and tough grasses that clung to the thin soil. There were no trees, no bushes taller than a man's knee. The landscape had a stark, empty beauty, like a world still waiting to be finished. To the east, the hills rose higher, their summits white with early snow. To the south and west, the sea ice was already forming, spreading outward from the shore in delicate crystals that would soon thicken into solid sheets. The air smelled of salt and cold stone. They found driftwood along the beaches, logs and branches that had floated across the Arctic Ocean from the forests of Siberia. This wood would be precious for fuel, supplementing the coal they had brought. They gathered it carefully, stacking it near the tent, counting each piece as if it were currency. Wildlife was present, though sparse. Foxes moved across the tundra, their fur beginning to turn white for winter. Seabirds nested along the cliffs, though many were already departing for warmer latitudes. And on the ice, they spotted their first polar bear, a distant figure, pale against the white expanse, moving with slow deliberation toward the open water. Knight studied the bear through binoculars. He was the most experienced hunter among them, and he knew that polar bears would be essential to their survival. Their meat was rich in calories. Their fat could be rendered into oil for cooking and light. Their hides provided warmth. If the hunting was good, they could live well. If it was not, but he did not finish the thought. For now, they focused on the immediate work, organizing the camp, establishing routines, preparing for the winter. Crawford made lists and assigned duties. Knight scouted the surrounding area for hunting grounds. Maurer and Galle checked the supplies, counting and recounting the provisions. Ada unpacked her sewing kit, needles, thread, patches of canvas and leather, and began inspecting the clothing and gear for wear. The first polar sunset came on their third evening. The sun did not set in the usual way, dropping quickly below the horizon. Instead, it lingered, sinking slowly toward the edge of the world, painting the sky in shades of amber, pink, and violet. For hours, the light stretched across the tundra, casting long shadows, turning the ice to gold. And then, finally, the sun dipped below the horizon and was gone. It would return the next morning, but not for long. Each day, the sun would rise a little later and set a little earlier. The window of daylight was closing, and soon it would close entirely. Inside the tent, the lantern glowed. The stove crackled softly. The five sat together in the warmth, not speaking, watching the shadows dance on the canvas walls. Outside, the Arctic night was beginning its slow descent. The tent canvas ripples once, then holds. Inside, a lantern glows. The first night on Wrangel Island begins. In the quiet hours of those early days, when the wind was low and the camp was still, Crawford sat by the lantern light and counted. He counted the tins of pemmican, dense cakes of dried meat and fat, designed to provide maximum nutrition with minimum weight. There were enough, he calculated, for perhaps 4 months at full rations. He counted the bags of flour, the boxes of hardtack, the containers of tea and sugar. He counted the rounds of ammunition, the spare parts for the rifles, the medical supplies in their small wooden chest. The numbers told a story, and it was not entirely reassuring. Stefansson had planned for a 1-year expedition, assuming the supply ship would return in September 1922. But the provisions aboard the Silver Wave had been calculated for 6 months, not 12. The theory was simple. The Arctic was generous, and the party would supplement their stores with hunting. Polar bears, seals, walruses, foxes, birds. The island teemed with life, according to Stefansson's reports. The men would live off the land, as Stefansson himself had done on his earlier expeditions. But Crawford, sitting by the lantern, felt a flicker of doubt. He had read Stefansson's books, had absorbed his confidence about the friendly Arctic. Yet here, in the dim tent on the edge of the world, the theory felt thin. What if the hunting failed? What if the game did not appear? What if the winter proved longer and harder than expected? He did not share these thoughts with the others. A leader, he believed, must project calm. So he wrote his concerns in his diary, closed the cover, and turned to the work of the day. The supplies were organized carefully. The food stores were divided into categories: daily rations, emergency reserves, hunting supplies. The ammunition was counted and stored in a dry corner of the tent, protected from moisture. The medical kit was inventoried: bandages, antiseptics, simple remedies for pain and fever. There was no doctor among them, no one with formal medical training. They would have to rely on common sense and luck. Ada was particularly useful during this process. Her hands were quick and precise, accustomed to sorting and organizing. She helped label the crates, stack the tins, fold the spare canvas and clothing into neat piles. The men watched her work with quiet appreciation. She did not speak much, but her competence was evident. One evening, as the wind picked up outside and the tent walls shuddered, Knight sat down beside Crawford and spoke frankly. "The numbers are tight," he said. "We need to start hunting soon, building up reserves before the deep winter." Crawford nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. The autumn was the best time for hunting. The animals were still active, fattening themselves for the cold months, and the ice was not yet so thick that travel became impossible. If they could stockpile meat and fat now, they would be better prepared for the darkness ahead. "We'll start tomorrow," Crawford said. "You lead the first party." Knight agreed. He was the most experienced hunter, the one who understood the rhythms of Arctic game. Maurer would accompany him, while Galle remained at camp to continue organizing supplies. Ada would stay as well, mending clothing and preparing food. That night, as the lantern burned low, Crawford wrote in his diary, "The provisions are adequate if supplemented by hunting. We must begin immediately. The ice is coming and the days are short. There is no time to waste." Outside, the wind hummed its endless song. The stars were beginning to appear, sharp and cold in the black sky. Somewhere on the ice, a polar bear moved through the darkness, its breath misting in the frigid air. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin. They count once more by lantern light. The numbers do not change, but the work is steady and the evening is calm. The first hunt was a success. Knight and Maurer departed early, when the sky was still gray with the last traces of twilight. They carried rifles, ammunition, and a small sled for hauling game. The ice near the shore was solid enough to walk on, though it creaked beneath their boots, reminding them that the sea was still alive beneath its frozen skin. They had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when Knight raised his hand, signaling a halt. Ahead, on a flat stretch of ice near a lead of open water, a polar bear stood motionless, its nose lifted to the wind. The bear was large, a male perhaps 8 or 9 feet long, its fur thick and white. It had not yet noticed them. Knight motioned for Maurer to stay back, then crept forward, using a pressure ridge for cover. The wind was in their favor, carrying their scent away from the bear. At 100 yards, Knight stopped. He raised his rifle slowly, steadied his breath, and fired. The bear fell. It was a clean shot, well placed. The animal did not suffer. Knight approached carefully, rifle ready, but the bear was still. They stood over it in silence for a moment, acknowledging the life that had been taken. Then the work began. Butchering a polar bear is hard labor. The hide must be removed carefully, preserved for later use. The meat must be cut into manageable sections and loaded onto the sled. The fat, precious fuel for cooking and light must be separated and stored. Knight and Maurer worked for hours, their hands growing numb despite their gloves, steam rising from the carcass in the cold air. By late afternoon, they were headed back to camp, the sled heavy with meat. The others saw them coming from a distance. Galle shouted, and Ada emerged from the tent to watch. Crawford met them at the edge of camp, his face breaking into a rare smile. "We eat well tonight," Knight said simply. And they did. That evening the tent smelled of roasting meat and rendered fat. They ate until they were full, a luxury they would not always have. The mood was warm, even jovial. For the first time since their arrival, the expedition felt like an adventure rather than an ordeal. The weeks that followed brought more success. The autumn hunting was good. They took seals from the ice, their meat and blubber adding to the stores. Foxes were trapped for their fur. Birds were shot when they appeared, though most had already flown south. Knight taught the others what he knew. He showed them how to read the ice, how to predict where seals might surface, how to approach game without alerting it. Maurer proved a capable student, his practical nature suited to the work. Galle was eager but clumsy, still learning to handle a rifle in the cold. Crawford led hunting parties when he could, though his duties as leader often kept him at camp. Ada did not join the hunts. She was afraid of the polar bears and had never learned to shoot. Instead, she stayed behind, preparing food, mending clothes, keeping the tent orderly. Her work was essential, though it lacked the drama of the hunt. Without her, their clothing would have fallen apart, their gear would have frayed. She worked quietly, asking for nothing, expecting little. The cached meat grew. They built a small storage area near the camp, stacking the frozen game in neat piles, covering it with canvas to protect it from foxes and weather. Each addition to the cache brought a sense of security. But even as they celebrated their success, Knight offered words of caution. "The animals are here now," he said one evening as the lantern flickered in the tent. "But they won't be here all winter. When the deep cold comes, the seals go under the ice and the bears follow them. We need to take as much as we can while we can." Crawford nodded. He understood. The Arctic was generous in its own way, but its generosity was seasonal. The window of abundance was closing. Outside, the sun sat on the horizon, its light fading to amber. The days were growing shorter. Soon, the sun would not rise at all. But for now, there was meat in the cache and warmth in the tent. The lantern glowed, the tea was hot, and the five allowed themselves a moment of hope. A bear falls on the ice. They work together to bring it home. Tonight, the camp smells of warmth and fat. By late October, the sun was barely rising. Each morning, it climbed a little less above the horizon, lingering for a few hours before sinking back into the gray. The light it cast was thin, almost reluctant, a pale wash of amber and blue that stretched across the tundra like a memory of warmth. The shadows grew longer, merging into a twilight that lasted for hours but never quite became day. 766. This phenomenon, the gradual disappearance of the sun before polar night, is a slow and steady process. It does not happen all at once. Rather, it creeps upon those who live in high latitudes, a gradual dimming that the body registers before the mind fully understands. The days feel shorter, the nights longer, until one morning the sun simply does not appear, and the realization arrives. This is the long dark. For the five on Wrangel Island, the fading light brought both practical and psychological challenges. Practically, the shorter days meant less time for hunting and outdoor work. Travel across the ice became more difficult, the dim light making it hard to spot cracks and pressure ridges. The cold deepened, too, as the sun's heat withdrew. Temperatures dropped steadily, and the wind grew sharper, cutting through clothing that had seemed adequate just weeks before. Ada spent long hours reinforcing their garments, patching holes, adding layers of fur lining, stitching seams that had begun to split. her needle moved by the light of the lantern, which burned now almost constantly. The lamp had become their sun, the center of their indoor world. Psychologically, the fading light was harder to describe but no less real. There is something in the human spirit that responds to sunlight, that draws energy and hope from the brightness of day. When that light withdraws, something within us withdraws as well. Moods darken, sleep patterns shift. The world outside the tent seems less inviting, and the tent itself, once a refuge, begins to feel like a cage. Crawford noticed these changes in himself and his companions. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became rarer. The men retreated into themselves, spending long hours staring at nothing or writing in their diaries. Galle, the youngest, seemed particularly affected. He grew quiet, his usual enthusiasm dimmed. Knight, experienced in the ways of the Arctic, recognized the danger. "We need routines," he told Crawford. "Regular schedules, even if they don't match the sun. Meals at set times. Work periods and rest periods. Something to hold onto when the light goes." Crawford agreed. He established a daily rhythm, breakfast at 8 o'clock regardless of the darkness outside. Morning work, hunting if conditions allowed, camp maintenance if not. Lunch at noon. Afternoon rest and reading. Evening meal, card games or conversation. Sleep. These small structures became lifelines. They gave shape to days that might otherwise have dissolved into formless darkness. The body learned when to wake and when to rest, even as the sky offered no guidance. The lantern remained central to this rhythm. It was lit at morning and extinguished at night, its flame marking the hours more reliably than the hidden sun. When someone woke in the darkness and saw the lantern glowing, they knew they were not alone. When it went out, they knew it was time to sleep. Outside the tent, the twilight deepened. The sky turned from blue to purple to black, and the stars emerged, thousands of them, scattered across the heavens like frost on a window pane. The northern lights appeared, too, dancing in green and white curtains above the ice. They were beautiful, mesmerizing, but also cold and distant. They offered light without warmth, beauty without comfort. Let us pause here for a moment and consider a question. When the world grows dark around us and the familiar lights of daily life begin to fade, what do we hold on to? What small rituals and routines sustain us through the long nights of the soul? Perhaps you have faced such a night yourself, not literal darkness, but a season of difficulty when the way forward was unclear. Perhaps you found, as the 5 on Wrangel Island found, that the smallest things can carry the greatest weight. A scheduled meal, a task to complete, a lamp to light, a purpose to fulfill. These are the anchors that keep us from drifting. Inside the tent, the lantern glowed. Outside, the twilight gave way to polar night. The sun rests on the horizon, neither rising nor setting. The world turns amber, then blue, then quiet. The polar night arrived not with a crash, but with a whisper. One morning in early November, if morning could still be called that, the sun did not rise. The sky lightened briefly to a deep blue along the southern horizon, a faint glow that lasted for an hour or two and then faded back to black. That was all. The sun had set for the last time until late January. For the next 3 months, the five would live in continuous darkness. This is difficult for those of us in lower latitudes to fully imagine. We are accustomed to the rhythm of day and night, to waking with the light and sleeping when it fades. On Wrangel Island, that rhythm no longer existed. The darkness was constant, broken only by the stars, the moon, and the occasional shimmer of the aurora. And yet life continued. The routines that Knight and Crawford had established became even more important now. Meals were prepared and eaten at set times, the cooking stove casting a warm glow through the tent. Work continued, hunting when the weather allowed, equipment repair and maintenance when it did not. Rest periods were observed. Card games were played. Books were read. Ada's role became increasingly central during these dark weeks. She was, in many ways, the heart of the camp's domestic life. Each day, she prepared the meals, stretching their provisions as far as possible, varying the monotony of pemmican and hardtack with whatever small touches she could manage. She brewed tea constantly, the warm cups becoming a comfort that transcended mere refreshment. Her sewing work continued unabated. In the cold, clothing wore out quickly, seams split, fabric frayed, holes appeared. Ada's needle moved steadily, repairing the damage, reinforcing the weak points, keeping the party clothed and warm. Her fingers grew calloused from the work, her eyes strained from sewing by lantern light. She did not complain. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but her presence was felt, a quiet steadiness that anchored the camp. The men, for their part, filled their hours as best they could. Crawford wrote extensively in his diary, recording the events of each day, the weather, the hunting results, his observations about morale and supplies. He saw himself as the expedition's chronicler, preserving a record for the world outside. His entries were careful, precise, and often hopeful, perhaps more hopeful than he truly felt. Knight spent hours maintaining the hunting equipment, cleaning rifles, sharpening knives, checking the traps and snares. He was a man of action, uncomfortable with idleness. When the weather allowed, he ventured onto the ice, sometimes alone, scouting for game. Even in the darkness, he could read the signs, the tracks in the snow, the holes where seals surfaced to breathe, the distant shapes of bears moving against the stars. Maurer was practical and uncomplaining. He helped with whatever needed doing, hauling firewood, repairing the tent, assisting with meals. He had a quiet sense of humor that surfaced occasionally, breaking the tension with a dry remark or an unexpected joke. Galle struggled more than the others. He was young and the darkness weighed on him. He missed his family, his studies, the warm days of Texas that seemed to belong to another world. He wrote letters that could not be sent, addressed to parents and friends who would not read them for many months. At night, when the others slept, he sometimes lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling, wondering how he had come to be here. Yet even Galle found moments of peace. He loved the northern lights, and when they appeared, those shimmering curtains of green and white dancing across the sky, he would bundle himself in furs and step outside to watch. The beauty of the aurora never failed to move him, a reminder that even in the darkest places, wonder remained. The tent itself became a world unto itself during these weeks. It was crowded, 5 people living in a space meant for fewer, but they learned to navigate around each other, to respect the small privacies that could be carved out. Sleeping areas were clearly defined. Personal belongings were kept in designated spots. Arguments arose occasionally, as they always do when people live in close quarters, but they were resolved quietly. The stakes were too high for lasting conflict. The lantern burned at the center of it all. It was lit each morning, filled with precious oil, its wick trimmed carefully to make the fuel last as long as possible. The circle of light it cast became their world, the only world that mattered. Outside was darkness and cold. Inside was warmth and each other. Let us pause again and ask another question, one that perhaps has no answer, but is worth holding nonetheless. Can a tent at the edge of the world, shared by 5 near strangers, become a home? What is it that makes a place feel like home? Is it walls and a roof? Or is it something else, something carried in the heart? Perhaps home is not a place at all, but a feeling. Perhaps it is the sense of safety, of belonging, of being known. Perhaps it is the simple presence of another human being, breathing softly in the darkness, a reminder that we are not alone. On Wrangel Island, in the winter of 1921, home was a canvas tent with frost on its walls, a stove that smoked, a lantern that flickered, and 4 companions whose faces had become as familiar as family. Ada threads her needle. Outside the wind hums low. Inside the tea is warm. The night passes slowly. The darkness was now complete. There is a quality to polar night that words struggle to capture. It is not simply the absence of light, as one might experience on a cloudy evening or in a room with the curtains drawn. It is something deeper, more encompassing, a darkness that seems to have weight and substance, that presses against the skin and settles into the bones. The sky above is black, scattered with stars so bright they seem almost aggressive. The ice below reflects nothing but the faint shimmer of moonlight and aurora. And all around, the silence stretches on without end. For the 5 on Wrangel Island, December brought the deepest darkness they had ever known. The sun would not return until late January, nearly 2 months away. In the meantime, they lived by the lantern's glow and the faint light of the stars. Their world had contracted to the small circle of warmth inside the tent, surrounded by a vastness they could no longer see but always felt. The routines they had established continued, meals at set times, work periods and rest periods, card games in the evening. But as the weeks wore on and the darkness persisted, the psychological strain began to show in small ways. Sleep became difficult. Without the sun to regulate their bodies' rhythms, the natural cycle of waking and resting began to drift. Some found themselves sleeping for 12 hours at a stretch, then lying awake through what should have been the night. Others could barely sleep at all, their minds racing in the darkness, their eyes refusing to close. Crawford noted these changes in his diary. He wrote of restlessness, of strange dreams, of a creeping sense of unreality that seemed to affect them all. He tried to maintain his optimism, to project confidence for the sake of the others, but even he felt the weight of the long dark pressing down. Night, perhaps because of his previous Arctic experience, seemed to handle the darkness better than most. He continued his hunting forays when conditions allowed, venturing onto the ice with a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other. The light from his lantern was visible for miles across the flat white expanse, a tiny flame moving through the immense darkness, like a firefly crossing an empty field. He returned from these trips with less and less game. The animals had grown scarce, as he had predicted. The seals had retreated beneath the thick ice, surfacing at breathing holes that were difficult to find in the darkness. The polar bears had followed them, ranging far from the island in search of food. The foxes remained, but they were wary and hard to trap. Ada continued her work inside the tent, her needle moving by lantern light. She seemed to draw strength from the work itself, from the steady rhythm of stitching and mending. When the others grew restless or irritable, she remained calm, her quiet presence a steadying influence. But even Ada felt the darkness. She later wrote in her diary of fear of the polar bears that roamed unseen in the night, fear of the unknown, fear of being so far from her son. She prayed often, whispering words in her native language, asking for protection and guidance. The prayers were a comfort, a thread connecting her to something larger than the frozen world around her. The northern lights appeared frequently during these weeks, their shimmering curtains of green and purple dancing across the sky. The five would sometimes emerge from the tent to watch, bundled in furs against the cold, their breath misting in the frigid air. The aurora was beautiful beyond description, waves of color rippling through the darkness like silk blown by an invisible wind. And yet there was something unsettling about the lights as well. They were so vast, so indifferent to the small figures watching from below. They offered beauty but no warmth, wonder but no comfort. They were a reminder that the universe was immense and ancient, and that the five souls on this frozen island were very, very small. Let us pause here and consider the darkness. Most of us in our daily lives never experience true darkness. Our cities glow with artificial light. Our homes are illuminated at the touch of a switch. Even on the darkest nights, there is usually some faint glow on the horizon, some reminder that other people are nearby, that civilization continues. But on Wrangel Island, there was none of that. The nearest settlement was hundreds of miles away, across frozen seas that no ship could cross. There were no other lights, no other people, no evidence that the world beyond the island still existed at all. In such darkness, the mind begins to wander. Old fears resurface. Old memories return. The boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin, and dreams bleed into reality. Some people find peace in this, a kind of enforced meditation, a stripping away of distractions until only the essential remains. Others find only anxiety, a growing sense of unease that has no specific cause but colors everything. The five experienced both. There were moments of genuine peace, evenings when the stove burned warmly, the tea was hot, and conversation flowed easily. There were moments of beauty, the aurora overhead, the stars sharp and brilliant, the silence so deep it seemed almost sacred. But there were also moments of fear, of doubt, of quiet desperation. These were not spoken aloud. Each person carried their darkness privately, not wishing to burden the others. But it was there beneath the surface, a shadow that matched the shadow outside. The lantern continued to burn. It had become more than a source of light. It was a symbol, a promise, a small defiance against the darkness. As long as the lantern burned, they were still alive. As long as the lantern burned, there was hope. Outside, the wind hummed its endless song. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the five waited as patiently as they could for the return of the sun. The darkness is complete now, but the stars are many and the lantern still burns. We rest here in the quiet. The new year arrived without celebration. January 1922 came and went, marked only by a notation in Crawford's diary. There were no festivities, no special meals. The supplies were too precious for that. Instead, the five observed the occasion quietly, acknowledging the passage of time with little more than a nod. The supply situation had become a constant concern. The provisions they had brought from Nome were running low. The pemmican tins that had seemed so plentiful in September were now more than half gone. The flour was dwindling. The tea and sugar were being rationed carefully, each cup measured and counted. The hardtack, those dense, dry biscuits that could last for years without spoiling, remained, but hardtack alone would not sustain them. Crawford kept meticulous records. Each day he noted what was consumed and what remained. He calculated how long the stores would last at current rates, and the numbers were troubling. Even with strict rationing, the food would not last until September, when the relief ship was expected to arrive. Everything depended on hunting. But hunting, which had been so successful in the autumn, had become increasingly difficult. The polar bears had migrated to distant ice, following the seals that were their primary prey. The seals themselves had become harder to find, surfacing at breathing holes that were scattered unpredictably across miles of frozen sea. The foxes remained, but their meat was lean and provided little nutrition. Knight led hunting expeditions whenever weather permitted, but he returned with less and less game. The parties would venture out in the darkness, lanterns in hand, searching for tracks or breathing holes. Sometimes they found nothing at all. Sometimes they found signs of animals that had already moved on. The rations were reduced. Crawford made the decision reluctantly, knowing its implications. From now on, they would eat less. The portions at each meal would be smaller. The intervals between meals might grow longer. They would tighten their belts and hope that spring would bring better hunting. Hunger is a strange companion. In its early stages, it manifests as a simple emptiness, a mild discomfort that comes and goes. But as the weeks pass and the body begins to consume itself, the sensations change. Energy fades. The limbs grow heavy. Tasks that once seemed simple become exhausting. The mind grows foggy, unable to concentrate for long periods. The five began to feel these effects. They moved more slowly now. Conversations grew shorter. The card games that had once filled the evenings became less frequent. The effort of concentrating on the cards seemed too great. They slept more, their bodies seeking to conserve energy. And then there was the scurvy. Scurvy is a disease of deficiency. It occurs when the body lacks vitamin C, a nutrient found in fresh fruits and vegetables. In an Arctic environment where no plants grow and fresh food is unavailable, scurvy is a constant threat. The traditional diet of indigenous Arctic peoples, rich in raw or lightly cooked meat and fat, provides enough vitamin C to prevent the disease. But the expedition's diet was different. They relied heavily on pemmican and hardtack, foods that were designed for preservation rather than nutrition. Knight was the first to show symptoms. It began subtly, a general fatigue that he attributed to the darkness and the strain of hunting. Then his gums began to bleed. His joints ached. Old wounds that had long since healed began to open again, the scar tissue breaking down as his body lost the ability to repair itself. He did not tell the others at first. He continued his work, pushing through the pain and exhaustion, unwilling to admit weakness. But eventually, the symptoms became too obvious to hide. Crawford examined him by lantern light, comparing what he saw against the medical guide they had brought from Nome. The diagnosis was not in doubt. Knight had scurvy. The treatment was simple in theory but difficult in practice. Fresh meat, raw or lightly cooked meat, consumed in sufficient quantities, could reverse the disease. The body would absorb the vitamin C and begin to heal. But fresh meat required successful hunting, and hunting had become desperately unreliable. They did what they could. When a fox was trapped or a seal was taken, Knight was given the freshest portions. The others watched him eat, hopping to see improvement, but the progress was slow. Ada took on the role of nurse. She had no medical training, but she had a gentle manner and a practical mind. She prepared Knight's meals carefully, ensuring he received the most nutritious portions. She kept him comfortable, adjusting his bedding, bringing him tea, checking on him throughout the day. Her care was tireless, and it would only grow more demanding in the months ahead. Meanwhile, the supplies continued to dwindle. The crates grew lighter. The counting sessions grew shorter. There was less and less to count. Crawford wrote in his diary, "We are hungry now, truly hungry. The stores will not last. Everything depends on the hunting, and the hunting is poor. Knight is ill. We must hold on until the ship arrives. We must believe it will come." The belief was becoming harder to maintain. The crates grow lighter. The portions grow smaller. They speak less now and rest more. The winter continues. There was no radio on Wrangel Island. This detail, easy to overlook, defined their existence more than almost anything else. In 1921, wireless communication was still a developing technology, expensive and unreliable. Stefansson had not provided the expedition with a radio set. The cost was too high, the equipment too heavy, the expertise to operate it unavailable. The five had been sent to the edge of the world with no way to call for help. They could not signal the outside world. They could not report their position, their condition, their dwindling supplies. They could not ask for an early rescue. They were utterly and completely alone. The nearest human settlement was hundreds of miles away, the Siberian coast to the west, the Alaskan coast to the east. Between them and civilization lay frozen seas that would not thaw until summer, and even then, passage was uncertain. The ice did not follow schedules. The ice did not care about human plans. The isolation weighed heavily. In the early months, they had spoken often of home. They had shared stories of their families, their friends, the places they missed. Crawford talked about Toronto, about his parents' house with its books and fireplaces. Knight described the forests of Oregon where he had grown up hunting deer and elk. Maurer spoke of Ohio with its green summers and gentle rains. Galle remembered Texas, the heat, the open sky, the feeling of warmth that seemed now like a distant dream. Ada spoke less than the others, but when she did, she spoke of her son. Bennett was 5 years old, living with relatives in Nome while Ada earned money for his medical care. She thought of him constantly, his face, his voice, the way he laughed when she tickled him. She wondered if he remembered her. She wondered if he knew how far away she was. They wrote letters. Crawford maintained a regular correspondence, writing to his parents, to Stefansson, to friends back home. He described the conditions on the island, their hunting successes and failures, his hopes for the relief ship. The letters were carefully composed, optimistic in tone, designed to reassure rather than alarm. Knight wrote to his family as well, though less frequently. His letters were shorter, more practical updates on their situation, requests for supplies to be sent with the relief ship. Ada wrote to Bennett. She told him she loved him. She told him she would be home soon. She told him to be good for his relatives, to eat his food, to grow strong. The letters were tender and simple, written in the halting English she had learned in school. None of the letters could be sent. They accumulated in a small pile near Crawford's sleeping bag, waiting for the ship that would not come until September. Every letter was an act of faith, faith that the ship would arrive, that they would survive to see it, that the words they wrote would eventually reach the people they loved. The writing itself was a comfort. To put pen to paper, to form words and sentences, was to maintain a connection with the world beyond the ice. It was a reminder that they were still part of something larger, still members of families and communities, still known and loved. But as the weeks passed and the pile of letters grew, the comfort became tinged with sadness. How long had it been since anyone had heard from them? Their families must be wondering. Their families must be waiting for word that never came. The silence worked both ways. They received no news from the outside world. They did not know what was happening in Nome, in Canada, in the countries they had left behind. Wars could be fought. Governments could fall, loved ones could be born or die, and they would have no way of knowing. The world continued without them, indifferent to their presence or absence. This is a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being without company, but the loneliness of being without connection. They had each other. They were rarely truly alone. But they were cut off from everything else, suspended in a frozen world that seemed to exist outside of time. What is it like to be forgotten? To exist in a place so remote that no one can reach you, no one can hear you, no one knows if you are alive or dead? This is a question worth sitting with, though it has no comfortable answer. Perhaps you have felt something similar, a moment of disconnection, of being unreachable, of existing apart from the flow of ordinary life. Perhaps you know the particular ache of silence, of waiting for a word that does not come. On Wrangel Island, that silence was absolute. And in that silence, the five held onto the only connections they had, each other, and the letters they could not send. They write letters home by lantern light. No ship will carry them, but the writing itself is a comfort, a small warmth. By February 1922, Knight could no longer walk unaided. The scurvy had progressed despite their efforts. His legs had weakened to the point where standing was painful, walking nearly impossible. The joints ached constantly, a deep throb that no amount of rest could ease. His gums bled freely, his teeth loosening in their sockets. His energy, once inexhaustible, had faded to nothing. He spent his days lying on his cot, wrapped in furs and blankets, watching the others move about the tent. The lantern light flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look older than his 28 years. He had been the strongest among them, the most experienced, the one they had all relied upon for hunting and guidance. Now he was the weakest, dependent on the care of others. Ada became his primary caretaker. She had taken on this role gradually, almost without realizing it. At first, it was small things, bringing him tea, adjusting his blankets, helping him sit up to eat. But as Knight's condition worsened, her duties expanded. She prepared his meals, choosing the most nutritious portions of whatever game they had. She cleaned his wounds, dabbing at the sores that had opened on his skin. She helped him with basic functions that he could no longer manage alone. It was exhausting work, and it was added to all her other responsibilities. She still cooked for the group, still mended clothing, still maintained the tent. But now she also nursed a man who needed constant attention, whose condition grew worse despite her efforts. Ada had never been trained as a nurse. She had no medical knowledge beyond common sense and the traditional remedies she had learned from her mother. But she had something perhaps more important: patience and compassion. She did not complain about the burden. She did not resent Knight for his weakness. She simply did what needed to be done, hour after hour, day after day. Knight, for his part, struggled with his dependence. He had always been a man of action, uncomfortable with idleness. Now he was forced to lie still, to accept help, to watch others do the work he could no longer do. The frustration was visible in his face, though he tried not to let it show. He apologized often, too often, Ada thought. He apologized for being a burden, for taking up resources, for being unable to contribute. Ada always shook her head and told him to rest. There was no need for apology. They were all in this together. The others did what they could to help. Crawford adjusted the work schedules to account for Knight's absence. Maurer and Galle took on additional hunting duties, venturing onto the ice in pairs while Crawford remained at camp to assist Ada. The hunting was still poor. Game remained scarce in the deep winter, but they tried, driven by the knowledge that fresh meat was Knight's only real medicine. When they did bring back game, Knight was given priority. The freshest meat, the richest fat, the parts most likely to contain the nutrients his body needed. He ate what he could, though his appetite was diminished. Sometimes he could manage only a few bites before exhaustion forced him to stop. Progress was slow. There were days when he seemed slightly better, a little more color in his cheeks, a little more strength in his voice. The others would allow themselves to hope, but then the symptoms would return and hope would fade again. Crawford consulted the medical guide repeatedly, searching for anything they might have missed. But the book offered little beyond what they already knew: fresh food, rest, and time. They were providing the first two as best they could. The third was out of their hands. The tent became quieter during these weeks. The easy conversation of autumn had faded. The card games had stopped. No one had the energy or the heart for them. When they spoke, it was about practical matters: the weather, the supplies, the hunting. The deeper fears remained unspoken. At night, the lantern burned low, casting long shadows on the canvas walls. Ada sat beside Knight, watching his chest rise and fall, listening to his breathing. Sometimes he slept peacefully. Other times he moaned or muttered, caught in dreams that brought him no rest. She would reach out then and touch his hand, a gentle reminder that he was not alone. And he would settle, his breathing steadying, his face relaxing into something like peace. The winter stretched on. Outside, the darkness was slowly, imperceptibly beginning to lift. The sun would return soon, not fully, but enough to brighten the southern horizon for a few hours each day. Spring was coming. But spring seemed very far away. Knight rests now more than he walks. Ada brings him tea. The tent is warm and the hours are slow. By late January 1923, the situation had become desperate. A full year had passed since the silver wave had departed, leaving them on the frozen shore. The relief ship that Stefansson had promised, the ship that was supposed to arrive in September 1922, had never come. They had watched the horizon all through that summer, scanning the sea for any sign of a vessel. None had appeared. The ice had been too thick. The ship, they later learned, had tried to reach them but had been turned back by impenetrable pack ice miles from the island. It had returned to Nome without ever sighting Wrangel Island. A second attempt had been planned for 1923, but the five had no way of knowing this. As far as they knew, they had been forgotten. Their supplies were now critically low. The hunting had improved slightly with the return of the sun, but not enough. Knight's scurvy had worsened over the year. He was now completely bedridden, unable to care for himself, dependent on Ada for everything. Crawford faced an impossible choice. They could stay and wait for the relief ship, assuming one was still coming. They could continue to ration their dwindling supplies, continue to hunt, continue to hope. But if the ship did not come, if the ice blocked passage again, they would starve. They might not survive another winter. Or they could try to reach help themselves. The Siberian coast lay approximately 100 miles to the west, across the frozen sea. In theory, a small party could walk across the ice, reach the mainland, and either find help or send word back to civilization. It was a desperate plan full of risks. The ice was treacherous, riddled with pressure ridges and leads of open water. The distance was formidable. Storms could strike without warning. But it might be their only chance. Crawford discussed the options with Maurer and Galle. Knight was too ill to contribute. He lay on his cot, listening but unable to participate. Ada listened as well, her face unreadable. In the end, the decision was made. Crawford, Maurer, and Galle would attempt the crossing to Siberia. If they succeeded, they could arrange for a rescue. If they failed, but no one wanted to speak of failure. Ada and Knight would remain on the island. This was the hardest part of the decision. Knight could not travel. His condition made that impossible. And someone needed to stay with him, to care for him, to keep him alive until help arrived. Ada was the only choice. She did not protest. She understood the logic, even as fear gripped her heart. She would be left alone with a dying man, on an island at the edge of the world, with no guarantee that help would ever come. But what else could be done? The preparations took several days. The men loaded a sled with supplies, food, ammunition, a tent, sleeping bags. They packed carefully, balancing the need for provisions against the weight they would have to haul across the ice. Every ounce mattered. The morning of departure arrived. It was late January and the sun had finally returned, a pale disk that rose above the southern horizon for a few hours each day, casting long shadows across the ice. The air was brutally cold, well below zero, but the sky was clear. Crawford, Maurer, and Galle gathered outside the tent. They were dressed in their warmest furs, their faces wrapped against the wind. The sled was loaded and ready. Ada emerged to see them off. Knight, too weak to stand, remained inside, but he had said his goodbyes earlier, clasping each man's hand, wishing them well. There was little to say. They all understood the stakes. They all knew this might be the last time they saw each other. Crawford spoke briefly. He told Ada to conserve the remaining supplies, to keep hunting as best she could, to take care of Knight. He told her that help would come, that they would reach Siberia, that they would send a ship, that she only had to hold on. Ada nodded. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Maurer and Galle said their own goodbyes, awkward, brief, the words of young men who did not know how to express what they felt. And then they were gone. Ada watched them walk away, three small figures against the vast white expanse. They moved slowly, the sled heavy behind them, their forms growing smaller and smaller against the ice. She watched until she could no longer see them. And then, alone in the silence, she turned and went back into the tent. They walk south toward a shore they cannot see. Ada watches until they disappear. Then she turns back to the tent. The tent was very quiet now. Where once there had been 5 voices, 5 sets of footsteps, 5 bodies moving and breathing and living together, now there were only 2, and one of those was fatting. Ada settled into a new routine shaped by necessity and survival. She woke early, or what she called early, for time had become fluid in this place. She lit the stove, melted snow for water, prepared a simple breakfast. She brought food to Knight, helping him sit up to eat, coaxing him to take a few bites when his appetite failed. Knight's condition continued to deteriorate. The scurvy had progressed beyond what rest and fresh meat could easily reverse. His body was failing, slowly but unmistakably. He slept more than he was awake. When he was conscious, he spoke little, his words coming in short, breathless phrases. Ada cared for him with patience and tenderness. She kept him clean, changed his bedding when it became soiled, applied what simple remedies she knew to his sores and wounds. She talked to him, even when he could not respond, quiet words about nothing in particular, just to fill the silence, just to remind him that he was not alone. But Ada could not spend all her time inside the tent. Survival demanded more. She needed to hunt. This was something she had never done before. In her life in Nome, hunting was men's work. She had never fired a rifle, never set a trap, never skinned an animal. The very idea of it frightened her. The guns were loud and violent, and the thought of confronting a polar bear made her tremble. But there was no one else. Crawford and the others were gone, walking toward a distant shore. If she and Knight were to eat, Ada would have to provide. She began with traps. Knight, in his lucid moments, had taught her the basics, where to set them, how to bait them, how to check them safely. She ventured out onto the tundra, her heart pounding, her eyes scanning for danger. The first few days, the traps were empty, but eventually she began to catch foxes, small, lean animals with little meat but something. Then she taught herself to shoot. The rifle was heavy and unfamiliar. The first time she fired it, the recoil nearly knocked her down. The noise was deafening, echoing across the empty ice. She missed the target completely. But she tried again, and again, and again. Slowly, painfully, she improved. She learned to steady the rifle against her shoulder, to sight along the barrel, to squeeze the trigger rather than jerk it. She began to hit what she aimed at, tin cans first, then rocks, then, eventually, game. Her first seal was a revelation. She had spotted it from a distance, resting on the ice near its breathing hole. Her heart raced as she approached, crouching low, moving slowly to avoid startling it. When she was close enough, she raised the rifle, steadied her breath, and fired. The seal fell. Ada stood for a long moment, staring at what she had done. She had killed. She, who had been afraid of guns, afraid of the Arctic, afraid of almost everything, she had provided food. She had survived. The work of butchering the seal was hard and bloody, but she did it. She dragged the meat back to camp, cached what she could not immediately use, and brought the freshest portions to Knight. He ate a little, and for a day or two he seemed slightly stronger. It was not enough to save him, but it was enough to keep her going. The weeks passed. February gave way to March. The days grew longer, the sun climbing higher above the horizon. The world began to thaw slowly at the edges. Ada fell into a rhythm, hunting, cooking, caring for Knight, sleeping and repeating. She stopped counting the days. Time moved differently now, measured not in calendars but in meals and tasks. She thought often of her son. At night, lying in the darkness, she pictured his face, heard his voice. She promised herself that she would see him again. She would survive this. She would return to him. She would hold him in her arms. That promise became her anchor. Ada walks the trapline alone. The wind is steady. She returns with what she can. It is enough for today. Summer arrived, and with it a cruel hope. By June 1923, the ice around Wrangel Island had begun to break. Leads of open water appeared along the coast, dark channels cutting through the white expanse. The sea was waking from its long winter sleep, and for the first time in months, passage to the island became theoretically possible. Ada watched the horizon every day. She would walk to a rise near the camp, shielding her eyes against the bright sun, scanning the water for any sign of a ship. The sky was vast and empty, the sea a glittering blue between the remaining ice floes. Birds had returned, murres, gulls, and other seabirds that filled the air with their cries. Life was returning to the island. But no ship appeared. Day after day, Ada climbed to her lookout point. Day after day, she saw nothing but water and ice and sky. The hope that had kindled with the thaw began to flicker. Where was the rescue? Where were Crawford and the others? Had they reached Siberia? Had anyone been told of their plight? She had no answers. She could only wait. Knight was dying. His decline had accelerated with the spring. The scurvy had done irreversible damage to his body. He could no longer sit up without help. He could barely eat. His voice, when he spoke at all, was a whisper. Ada sat with him through the long Arctic days, the tent walls glowing with midnight sun. She held his hand, talked to him softly, prayed for him in her native language. She did not know if he could hear her. She did not know if it mattered, but she did it anyway. He spoke sometimes of home, fragments of memory, disconnected images, the forests of Oregon, the sound of rain on a cabin roof, his mother's face. He was slipping away, retreating into a past that was more real to him now than the tent in which he lay. Ada did not try to bring him back. She let him drift, let him find whatever peace he could in those distant memories. She knew that her efforts could no longer save him. She could only ease his passage. And still she watched the horizon. The summer days blurred together. The sun circled the sky without setting, turning night into endless twilight. Ada hunted when she could, maintaining the food supply, keeping herself fed. She continued to care for Knight, though his needs grew simpler as his body failed. One day, she could not say exactly when, for the days had lost their names. She realized that she was talking to herself, aloud in full sentences as if someone were there to listen. The silence had grown so deep, so absolute, that her own voice had become her only companion. She did not stop. The sound of words, even her own words, was a comfort. It reminded her that she was still alive, still present, still human. But the loneliness was immense. She missed the others, their voices, their movements, their simple presence. She missed the life she had known in Nome, the community of neighbors and friends. She missed her son with an ache that never faded, that lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. If you were in her place, watching an empty horizon, waiting for help that might never come, what would sustain you? What would you hold on to when hope itself begins to fade? Perhaps you have faced moments like this, not so dramatic perhaps, but similar in essence. Moments when the waiting seemed endless, when the outcome was uncertain, when all you could do was continue. Ada continued. That is the simplest and most profound thing that can be said about her. She continued. The sun circles but does not set. Ada watches the sea each day. The horizon remains empty. She returns to the tent. Lorne Knight died on June 23, 1923. He passed quietly in the early hours of what would have been morning in other places. that strange, sunlit hour when the Arctic world is brightest and most still. Ada was beside him, as she had been so often in recent weeks. She had fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted from the long vigil, and when she woke, she knew immediately that something had changed. The tent was silent, too silent. She looked at Knight. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful. His chest no longer rose and fell. The struggle was over. Ada sat for a long time, not moving. She did not cry, not then. The tears would come later in waves that surprised her with their force. But in that first moment there was only stillness, a vast and empty calm. She had known this was coming. For weeks she had watched him fade, had seen the life draining from his body day by day. She had prepared herself as best she could. But no preparation is ever truly adequate. Death, when it arrives, is always a shock. She spoke to him softly, words in her native language, a prayer, a farewell, a blessing. She did not know if his spirit could hear her, but she spoke anyway. It was what her people did. It was what felt right. Then she began the work. Knight could not remain in the tent. The summer sun was warm, and the body would not keep. He needed to be buried, given a proper resting place on the land he had struggled to survive. Ada wrapped him carefully in blankets and canvas, creating a shroud as dignified as she could manage. She was not strong. She had never been strong in the physical sense, but grief and determination gave her a power she did not know she possessed. She dragged his body outside across the tundra to a spot she had chosen, a low rise overlooking the sea where the ground was softer and could be dug. The digging was hard. The permafrost resisted her shovel, yielding only reluctantly. But she worked steadily, hour after hour, until she had excavated a shallow grave, not deep, but deep enough. She laid Knight in the grave with as much care as if he had been her own brother. She arranged his shroud, smoothed the fabric, spoke a final prayer. Then she filled the grave, piling stones on top to protect it from animals. When she was finished, she stood at the graveside, her hands raw, her body aching. The wind blew gently across the tundra, carrying the smell of salt and thawing earth. The sea glittered in the distance. She was alone now, truly, completely alone. The weight of that realization settled over her slowly, like the cold. There was no one left, no one to talk to, no one to share the work, no one to help if she became injured or ill. She was the last person alive on Wrangel Island. But she was alive, and she intended to stay that way. Ada allowed herself one day of rest. She stayed inside the tent, not hunting, not working, simply sitting with her grief. She cried long, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. She prayed. She slept. And then, when the day was over, she rose. There was work to be done. There was a son waiting for her in Nome. There was a ship that might yet come. She would survive. Before she left the graveside for the last time, Ada gathered a few small stones and arranged them into a rough marker. She did not carve Knight's name. She had no tools for that, but she knew where he lay. The stones would remind her, would mark the spot for anyone who might come after. The wind whispered across the tundra. The waves lapped against the distant shore. And Ada Blackjack, seamstress from Nome, mother of Bennett, walked back to the tent to continue her vigil. The tent is quiet now. Ada sits alone. Outside, the wind hums its endless song. She breathes, she continues. The days after nights passing stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months. Ada Blackjack was alone now, the sole living person on Wrangel Island, perhaps the most isolated human being on Earth. There was no one to speak to, no one to share the work, no one to turn to in moments of fear or doubt. There was only the tent, the tundra, the sea, and the endless Arctic sky. And yet she continued. Each morning, if morning could be called that beneath the circling midnight sun, Ada rose from her sleeping bag and began the work of survival. She lit the stove, its familiar crackle a comfort in the silence. She melted snow for water, boiled tea, prepared what food she had. She ate slowly, deliberately, rationing each portion with care. Then she went outside to hunt. The skills she had learned in desperation had become second nature. She moved across the tundra with purpose now, her eyes scanning for game, her rifle ready. She had lost her fear of the weapon. Necessity had burned it away. The gun was a tool, nothing more, and she used it as she used the needle and thread, with precision, with patience, with quiet determination. The hunting was better in summer. Seals basked on the ice floes, easier to approach in the bright light. Birds nested along the cliffs, their eggs providing precious nourishment. Occasionally she spotted a polar bear in the distance, its pale form moving against the white ice. She kept her distance from the bears. She was not foolish, but she no longer trembled at the sight of them. They were part of this world as she was. They were fellow survivors. She cached her kills carefully, storing meat and fat for the uncertain days ahead. The cache grew slowly but steadily, a hedge against the future. She did not know when rescue might come, if it came at all, and she prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. Inside the tent, she maintained order. The canvas walls had grown weathered over the long months, patched in a dozen places where Ada's needle had repaired tears and holes. The interior was neat, organized, a reflection of Ada's character. Her sewing kit sat in its customary place. The remaining supplies were stacked precisely. Knight's belongings had been gathered and set aside, ready to be returned to his family if the opportunity ever came. And there was the lantern. It still burned in the evenings, or what Ada called evenings, those hours when she chose to rest even though the sun continued its endless circle. The flame was smaller now, the oil carefully conserved, but it burned nonetheless. The light it cast was familiar, reassuring. It had illuminated this tent since the beginning, had witnessed everything that had happened within these canvas walls. It was, in some strange way, a companion. Ada wrote in her diary. She had not been a consistent diarist before. Writing did not come easily to her, and her English was imperfect. But now, alone with no one to speak to, the diary became essential. She recorded the weather, the hunting, the state of the supplies. She wrote about her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. She wrote about Bennett, about her longing to see him, about the prayers she offered each night for his safety and her own. The writing was laborious. Her handwriting was careful, almost childlike, each letter formed with deliberate effort. But the act of writing was itself a kind of survival. It proved that she was still thinking, still feeling, still human. It created a record that might outlast her, a testimony that she had existed, that she had struggled, that she had refused to give up. Some entries were brief. Caught one seal today, windy, hard to walk. Others were longer, more reflective. I think of Bennett every day. I wonder if he thinks of me. I promise I will come home to him. I will not die here. I will not. The loneliness was profound, but Ada found ways to manage it. She talked aloud to herself, to the empty air, to the spirit of night that she sometimes imagined still lingered in the tent. She sang songs from her childhood in Yupiat melodies that her mother had sung to her. She recited prayers, the familiar words of comfort even when their meaning seemed distant. And she worked, always she worked. The work was salvation. When her hands were busy, sewing, cooking, butchering, repairing, her mind had less room for despair. The tasks of survival demanded attention, focus, presence. They pulled her back from the edge of hopelessness again and again. There were dark moments. Of course there were. Nights when the loneliness seemed unbearable, when the silence pressed against her like a physical weight, when she wondered if she would ever see another human face. She cried sometimes, alone in the tent, her sobs swallowed by the endless Arctic quiet. But she always rose the next morning. She always lit the stove, made her tea, picked up her rifle. She always continued. The summer wore on. July became August. The sun began at last to dip below the horizon for a few hours each night, bringing a brief twilight that felt almost like darkness after the endless day. The ice was breaking up along the coast, the sea opening in dark channels that might, just might, allow a ship to pass. Ada watched the horizon with renewed intensity. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the sea, civilization continued. Somewhere, perhaps, a ship was making its way north. She had to believe it. She had to hold on to hope. Ada works each day. She hunts. She mends. She writes in her diary. The work itself is survival. August 19, 1923. The morning was gray and still, a thin fog hanging over the water. Ada had risen early, as always, and made her way to the lookout point where she scanned the horizon each day. The ritual had become almost mechanical. She no longer expected to see anything, but she looked anyway because hope, however faint, refused to die completely. She raised her hand to shield her eyes against the pale light. The sea stretched away to the south, a flat expanse of gray water scattered with drifting ice. Nothing moved. Nothing. Wait. There was something. A dark shape small in the distance, barely visible against the gray. Ada squinted, her heart suddenly pounding. Was it ice? A whale? Her eyes had fooled her before, had turned distant ice floes into ships that vanished when she looked again. But this shape did not vanish. It grew. Slowly, impossibly, the dark spot on the horizon became larger. It took on form, a hull, a mast, the unmistakable silhouette of a vessel. Smoke rose from its stack, a thin gray line against the gray sky. A ship was coming. Ada stood frozen for a long moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. After all these months, after all the waiting and watching and hopping, a ship. It was real. It was here. Then she ran. She ran back to the camp, her legs carrying her faster than she had moved in months. She grabbed a piece of bright fabric, a signal flag, and raced back to the shore, waving it frantically above her head. She shouted, though she knew the ship was too far to hear her. She waved and shouted and jumped, desperate to be seen. The ship continued to approach. It was making for the island, navigating carefully through the scattered ice. It grew larger and larger, its details becoming clear. The weathered hull, the working crew on deck, the name painted on the bow. The Donaldson. It was a small vessel, a trading ship that had been chartered to search for the Wrangel Island party. For months, the outside world had wondered what had happened to the expedition. The relief ship that had failed to reach them in 1922 had raised the alarm. Another attempt had been organized for 1923, and the Donaldson had drawn the assignment. The captain had not expected to find anyone alive. The reports he had received were grim. The ice had been impassable for 2 consecutive years. No word had come from the island since the party had been landed in 1921. Crawford, Maurer, and Galle had attempted to walk to Siberia and had never been seen again. The most optimistic assessments held that perhaps 1 or 2 survivors might remain. The pessimistic assessments, which were more common, assumed that all 5 had perished. But there on the shore was a figure waving a flag, a small figure dressed in furs, jumping and shouting. A woman. The ship dropped anchor offshore. A boat was lowered and several crew members rowed toward the beach. Ada waded into the shallows to meet them, the cold water soaking through her boots, tears streaming down her face. The first man to reach her was the captain, Harold Noyce. He stepped out of the boat and stared at her in disbelief. "Are you Ada Blackjack?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. "Is there anyone else?" Ada shook her head. The tears came harder now, her body shaking with sobs. "They are all gone," she managed. "All of them. I am the only one." The captain took her arm gently, steadying her. The crew gathered around, their faces a mixture of wonder and sorrow. They had found a survivor, a woman, alone, who had endured nearly 2 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They helped her into the boat and rowed back to the ship. Ada sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the island that had been her prison and her home. The tent was still visible on the shore, a small canvas triangle against the gray tundra. Knight's grave lay somewhere beyond it, marked by its humble pile of stones. She was leaving. After everything, she was finally leaving. The crew treated her with kindness. They gave her food, fresh food, the likes of which she had not tasted in months. They gave her clean clothes, a warm berth, a place to rest. They asked her questions gently at first, trying to understand what had happened. Ada told them what she could. She spoke of the long winters, the failed hunts, the dwindling supplies. She spoke of Knight's illness and death, of Crawford and the others walking away across the ice and never returning. She spoke of the months alone, the hunting, the waiting. The crew listened in silence. Some of them wept. The Donaldson remained at the island long enough to search for any further signs of the expedition. They found the tent, the supplies, the cache of meat that Ada had accumulated. They found Knight's grave and stood beside it in respectful silence. They found no trace of Crawford, Maurer, or Galle. Then on August 20, the ship raised anchor and turned south. Ada stood at the rail as Wrangel Island receded into the distance. The gray shore grew smaller, the tent vanishing into the landscape, until finally there was nothing but the gray sea and the gray sky. She was going home. A dark shape appears on the horizon. Ada watches. It grows larger, a ship. At last a ship. The voyage south took several weeks. The Donaldson navigated carefully through the ice-strewn waters, making its way toward the Alaskan coast. Ada spent most of the journey resting, her body slowly recovering from the long ordeal. She ate regular meals, simple ship's fare, but to her it tasted like a feast. She slept in a real berth, with blankets and a pillow, luxuries that seemed almost impossibly soft after months on the frozen ground. The crew gave her space, sensing that she needed time to process what she had experienced. They asked few questions, though their curiosity was obvious. They treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Word had spread quickly through the ship. This small, quiet woman had done something remarkable. She had survived alone in the Arctic for months, hunting her own food, maintaining her camp, refusing to give up. Ada did not see herself as remarkable. She had simply done what needed to be done. There had been no alternative. As the ship approached Alaska, her thoughts turned increasingly to Bennett, her son. The reason she had taken this job in the first place, the reason she had endured everything that followed. He was 7 years old now. She had missed 2 years of his childhood, 2 years of watching him grow. Would he remember her? Would he still know her face? The Donaldson arrived in Nome on August 31, 1923. The town had changed little in her absence. The same weathered buildings, the same muddy streets, the same gray sky hanging over the Bering Sea. But to Ada, it seemed impossibly vibrant, impossibly alive. There were people everywhere going about their daily business, talking and laughing and living their ordinary lives. After the silence of Wrangel Island, the noise was almost overwhelming. Word of her survival had preceded her. A crowd had gathered at the dock, and when Ada stepped off the gangway, they erupted in cheers. Reporters pushed forward, shouting questions. Photographers snapped pictures. The attention was bewildering, almost frightening. But Ada's eyes were searching the crowd for only one face. And then she saw him, Bennett, her son. He was standing near the back of the crowd, holding the hand of the relative who had cared for him during her absence. He had grown so much. He was taller now, his face more mature. But his eyes were the same, and when they met hers, they widened with recognition. "Mama," he said, uncertain. Ada pushed through the crowd, ignoring the reporters, ignoring the cheers. She fell to her knees and gathered her son into her arms, holding him tight, her body shaking with sobs. He clung to her, his small arms wrapped around her neck, and for a long moment the rest of the world ceased to exist. She was home. She was finally home. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, medical examinations, and official inquiries. Everyone wanted to know what had happened on Wrangel Island. Everyone wanted to hear her story. Ada answered their questions as best she could, though she found the attention exhausting. She was not comfortable with fame. She had never sought it. The fate of the others was confirmed through subsequent investigations. Crawford, Maurer, and Galle had attempted to walk to Siberia and had perished somewhere on the ice. Their bodies were never recovered. The conditions that year had been unusually severe, the ice treacherous and unstable. They had taken a calculated risk, and the risk had not paid off. Knight had died of scurvy and related complications, as Ada had witnessed. His body remained on Wrangel Island, in the grave she had dug for him. Of the 5 who had landed on that frozen shore in September 1921, only Ada Blackjack had survived. She did not dwell on this distinction. She did not see herself as a hero, though others would apply that word to her in the years to come. She had simply done what was necessary, one day at a time, until the days finally brought rescue. Now at last she could rest. Reset, the shore of home appears. Ada holds her son again. The world asks questions, she answers few. In the months and years that followed Ada's rescue, questions arose. How had this happened? How had 5 people, 4 young men and 1 woman, come to be stranded on a frozen island with inadequate supplies and no means of communication? Who was responsible? What lessons could be learned? The answers, when they emerged, pointed in many directions, but one name appeared more often than any other: Vilhjalmur Stefansson. Stefansson had organized the expedition. He had recruited the members, arranged the financing, planned the logistics. He had assured the volunteers that the Arctic was friendly, that living off the land was not only possible but relatively easy for those who knew how. He had sent them north with provisions calculated for 6 months, confident that hunting would make up the difference. He had been wrong. The hunting, though adequate in autumn, had failed in winter. The game had migrated, as Arctic game often does, and the party had been left with dwindling supplies and no way to replenish them. The relief ship had been unable to reach them, not once, but twice, blocked by ice that Stefansson had assured everyone would be navigable. Stefansson himself never visited Wrangel Island. He remained in the south, lecturing and writing, promoting his theories of Arctic hospitality while his volunteers starved on a frozen shore. When word of the disaster reached him, he expressed sorrow but accepted little blame. The Arctic, he maintained, had betrayed them, an unusual season, an unpredictable ice year. It was bad luck, nothing more. Others saw it differently. The expedition had been poorly conceived from the start. The volunteers were too young, too inexperienced. The provisions were inadequate. The lack of a radio was inexcusable. The assumption that hunting would sustain them through an Arctic winter was, at best, naive. We do not revisit these questions to assign blame. The men who died cannot speak for themselves, and Stefansson, whatever his faults, believed sincerely in his vision of the Arctic. He was not a villain, but he was wrong, and his wrongness cost lives. Perhaps the more useful question is this: what can we learn? The Arctic is not friendly. It is beautiful, certainly, achingly beautiful in its vast white silences and its shimmering lights. But it is also unforgiving. It does not care about human plans or human hopes. It follows its own rhythms, and those who enter it must do so with humility, with preparation, and with respect. The expedition failed because it lacked these things. It assumed too much, prepared too little, and trusted too completely in theories that had not been tested against reality. When the theories failed, there was no backup, no margin for error, no way out. Here, perhaps, we might pause to ask ourselves a question, the last one we will pose in this long night's journey. When we venture into the unknown, whether a frozen wilderness or any unfamiliar territory of life, how do we balance optimism with caution? How do we hold on to hope without letting it blind us to danger? And when our plans fail, as plans sometimes do, what reserves do we call upon to carry us through? There are no easy answers, but the question itself is worth holding, turning over in the quiet hours, considering as we navigate our own uncertain paths. The investigation into the Wrangel Island disaster concluded without formal charges. Stefansson's reputation suffered but did not collapse. He continued to write and lecture, though his vision of the friendly Arctic was viewed with greater skepticism thereafter. The real legacy of the expedition was carried by Ada Blackjack, in her survival, in her silence, in the quiet dignity with which she lived the rest of her life. We trace the paths they took, the choices they made. The ice does not explain itself. We can only try to understand. Let us pause now to remember them. Allan Crawford, 22 years old, the leader of the expedition, chosen by Stefansson for his enthusiasm and education. He was the son of a professor, a young man with ambitions and dreams. He loved adventure, loved the idea of exploring unknown lands and planting flags in distant places. He walked south across the ice toward Siberia in January 1923, hopping to find help for his companions. He was never seen again. We do not know exactly what happened to Crawford. The ice is vast and it keeps its secrets. Perhaps he and his companions encountered open water they could not cross. Perhaps a storm overtook them. Perhaps the cold simply became too much and they lay down to rest and did not rise. We will never know, but we can remember him, his youth, his hope, his willingness to take on a task that proved too great. Milton Galle, 19 years old, the youngest of the party, a Texan with a love of science. He had joined the expedition to study the Arctic environment, to gather data, to contribute something meaningful to human knowledge. He wrote letters home that were never sent, letters filled with observations about the ice and the wildlife and the strange beauty of the polar night. He walked south with Crawford and Maurer, carrying his share of the supplies, doing his part. He was never seen again. Galle was barely more than a boy. He had his whole life ahead of him, a career, perhaps a family, decades of experiences he would never have. The ice took all of that, left only the letters and the memory. Fred Maurer, 28 years old, a practical man from Ohio, steady and hardworking. He had traveled north before, had some experience with cold climates, but nothing that could have prepared him for Wrangel Island. He was quiet, reliable, the kind of man who did his work without complaint. He walked south with the others, hopping to reach Siberia, hopping to bring help. He was never seen again. Maurer left behind a family, parents who waited for word that never came, who learned eventually that their son had vanished into the white expanse and would not return. Their grief is lost to history, but we can imagine it, can feel its echo across the years. Lorne Knight, 28 years old, the most experienced of the party, the one who knew the Arctic best. He had worked with Stefansson before, had spent time on the ice, had learned the skills of polar survival. He taught the others what he knew, led the hunting parties, tried to keep them alive. But even his knowledge could not overcome the scurvy that slowly destroyed his body. He died on June 23, 1923, in a tent on Wrangel Island, nursed by Ada Blackjack until the very end. Knight is buried on the island still. His grave, marked by the stones Ada placed there, remains a silent testament to his struggle. The wind blows over it. The seasons pass, but the stones endure. We pause to remember them, not as heroes necessarily. That word is too often used and too easily worn out, but as people, human beings with all the complexity and fragility that implies. They made choices, some wise and some unwise. They faced circumstances beyond their control. They struggled, and in the end they were lost. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their lives deserve to be acknowledged. They were not forgotten, not entirely, because Ada survived to tell their story and because we tonight have listened. May they rest in peace wherever they are. May the ice which took them also hold them gently. We pause to remember them, young lives, hopeful lives. The ice took them, but their names remain. Ada Blackjack returned to Alaska and lived the rest of her life in relative obscurity. She did not seek fame. The attention that followed her rescue was uncomfortable for her, and she avoided it whenever possible. She gave interviews when pressed, answered questions about her ordeal, but she did not embellish or dramatize. She spoke simply, plainly, as she had always spoken. In the years immediately following her return, she received some recognition. Newspapers hailed her as a hero, the female Robinson Crusoe, one headline called her. She was awarded a small sum of money from the expedition's organizers, though it was far less than she deserved. Stefansson, despite his role in the disaster, did not go out of his way to acknowledge her sacrifice. Ada did not complain. She took what was offered and returned to her life. She raised her son, Bennett. This had always been her primary concern, the reason she had taken the job in the first place. She worked to support him, taking whatever employment she could find. She lived modestly in small apartments and rented rooms, never accumulating wealth or property. The Arctic had not made her rich. It had only made her a survivor. Bennett grew up, married, had children of his own. Ada became a grandmother. The years passed, and the story of Wrangel Island faded from public memory. New headlines replaced the old ones. New disasters captured attention. Ada's ordeal became a footnote in Arctic exploration history, remembered by specialists but largely forgotten by the general public. She did not mind. She had never wanted to be famous. She wanted only to live, to care for her family, to find whatever peace was available in a difficult world. In her later years, she lived in Palmer, Alaska, a small town north of Anchorage. She was quiet, kept to herself, did not speak much of the past. Occasionally, a researcher or journalist would track her down, asking about Wrangel Island, and she would answer their questions patiently. But she did not dwell on those years. They were behind her. She died on May 29, 1983, at the age of 85. She was buried in Anchorage, far from the frozen shore where she had once fought for her life. Her grave is modest as she would have wanted it. No grand monuments, no elaborate memorials, just a simple marker bearing her name. But her story endures. In the decades since her death, Ada Blackjack has been rediscovered by historians and writers. Books have been written about her, articles published, documentaries produced. Her survival is now recognized as one of the most remarkable feats of endurance in Arctic history. She has been called a hero, that word again, so often used but in her case perhaps deserved. What made her survival possible? The question has been asked many times and the answers vary. Her Inupiat heritage, some say, the traditional knowledge of Arctic survival that was part of her cultural inheritance. Her determination, others argue, the sheer force of will that kept her going when hope seemed lost. Her love for her son, still others suggest, the need to return to Bennett to fulfill her promise to him. Perhaps it was all of these things. Perhaps it was something that cannot be named, some quality of the human spirit that rises when everything else has fallen away. We do not need to explain it. We need only to acknowledge it, to honor it, to remember. Ada Blackjack lived. She survived. She came home. And that is enough. Ada lived many more years quietly. She did not seek attention. She raised her son. She carried on. The island remains. Wrangel Island exists today much as it did a century ago. The tundra stretches away toward distant hills. The gravel beaches line the coast. The wind blows across the empty land, carrying the smell of salt and cold stone. The ice comes and goes with the seasons, sealing the island in winter and releasing it, sometimes in summer. Since 1926, Wrangel Island has been administered by Russia. It is now a nature reserve, protected by international agreements, home to one of the largest populations of Pacific walruses in the world. Polar bears den there in significant numbers. Snowy owls nest on the tundra. Gray whales feed in the surrounding waters. Few people visit. The island is remote, difficult to reach, protected from exploitation by its sheer inaccessibility. Occasional scientific expeditions land there to study the wildlife or the permafrost. Tourists, in small numbers, arrive on icebreaker cruises, glimpsing the shore from the deck before moving on. The remnants of human habitation are scattered across the island. Soviet-era buildings stand abandoned, relics of a weather station that operated for decades before being closed. Debris from various expeditions lies half buried in the tundra, slowly decaying in the cold air. And somewhere on the island, Knight's grave remains. The exact location is uncertain. The stones Ada placed there in 1923 may have shifted, scattered by frost heave and animal activity. No formal marker was ever erected, but the grave is there, somewhere on that low rise overlooking the sea, holding the remains of a man who came to the Arctic with hope and did not leave. The island does not remember. It does not mourn. It simply continues as it has continued for millennia, indifferent to the small dramas of human life that have played out on its surface. The ice forms and melts. The animals come and go. The seasons turn. And yet there is something moving about this indifference. The island's endurance is a kind of testimony, a reminder that the world is vast and old, that human lives, however precious to us, are brief flickers in the long story of the earth. We come and go. The land remains. If you were to stand on Wrangel Island today, you would see much of what Ada saw a century ago. The same tundra, the same hills, the same gray sky, the same silence, deep and absolute, the same wind humming its endless song. You would be standing where they stood, Crawford and Knight and Maurer and Galle and Ada. You would be breathing the same cold air, looking at the same distant horizon. You would be connected, across time, to those 5 souls who came to this place with hope and found instead an ordeal that tested them beyond endurance. 4 did not survive, 1 did. The island does not distinguish between them. The island does not judge or evaluate. It simply is, a frozen witness holding its secrets, enduring through the years. Polar bears still walk the shore as they walked when Ada watched them with fear and fascination. The ice still comes, sealing the island away from the world. The midnight sun still circles in summer, and the polar night still descends in winter. Time moves on quietly. The island remains. The wind still blows across the tundra. Polar bears walk the shore. Time moves on quietly. And so we come to the end of our journey. We have traveled far tonight, across time and space, to a frozen island at the edge of the world. We have met 5 people who stepped onto that island in 1921, full of hope and confidence, believing they would stay for 1 year and return home with stories of adventure. 4 of them never came back. Allan Crawford, the young leader, Milton Galle, the aspiring scientist, Fred Maurer, the steady worker, Lorne Knight, the experienced hunter. Each of them had a life, a family, dreams for the future. Each of them faced the Arctic's indifference and did not survive. We remember them tonight. We speak their names, and in speaking them, we keep them alive, at least for a moment, at least in memory. And we remember Ada Blackjack. She was not a hero when she arrived on Wrangel Island. She was a seamstress, a mother, a woman who needed work. She was afraid of guns, afraid of polar bears, afraid of the unknown. She did not ask for the ordeal that awaited her. But when the ordeal came, she rose to meet it. She learned to hunt, to survive, to endure. She cared for a dying man with tenderness and patience. She buried him with dignity. She faced months of absolute solitude without losing her mind or her determination. She survived. She came home. She raised her son. That is the story we have told tonight. It is a story of tragedy, certainly, of plans that failed, of hopes that were crushed, of lives that were lost. But it is also a story of resilience, of the human capacity to endure, of the quiet strength that sometimes emerges when everything else has been stripped away. We do not know what gave Ada her strength. Perhaps she did not know herself, but we can honor it, can recognize it, can draw whatever inspiration we need from her example. The lantern that burned through those long Arctic nights still burns, in a sense. It burns in the memory of those who tell Ada's story, in the books and articles and documentaries that preserve it. It burns in us tonight as we sit with the silence and the wind and the weight of what we have witnessed. Thank you for resting here, for listening, for traveling with us to that frozen shore. The journey has been long, but we have made it together. The story is told. The night is quiet. The lantern glows. Rest now. We have traveled far tonight, through ice and darkness and waiting, through loss and survival. Thank you for resting here.